afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. My name is Michele Arndt, and I'm honored to be here today. My degree program, I just completed my Master's of Divinity at North Park Theological Seminary. So I think my diploma is actually in the mail as we speak. I hope it's in the mailbox when I get home. My career goals for right now, I planted a church with the Evangelical Covenant in April of 2019. We just turned 3, which is a big deal in church planting experience. And I would just say that my career goals going forward would be just to continue to press into everything that I've come to know and understand about Jesus personally in order to continue to grow pastorally. So that would probably be my main goal. However that lands, that's for God to decide. But my goal is just to continue pressing in with him. As to what led me to write my paper, which I will give you the title of first, my paper is titled A Medieval Makeover, Women's Roles Before and After the Reformation. What prompted me to write this paper, I suppose I could say, was a final course requirement for my Women, the Bible, and the Church class with Dr. Dennis Edwards and Dr. Rosalie Norman. That would be the low-hanging fruit. But more specifically and more personally, as we've heard many participants in the workshops and the main stage keynote speakers share, I have spent the majority of my life in complementarian churches. And it wasn't until I came on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship as a campus staff minister in 2010 that I began to entertain that there were questions I never knew existed. And once I began to know what the questions were, I set forth to find answers to them, better answers than the ones that had been given to me to that point. I would actually say it was in 2013 at a women's staff conference for InterVarsity Milwaukee, where Melody Marsky, who's here today, and we've not seen each other since, she presented a workshop presenting a biblical case for women in ministry, and it was the first time I had heard a clear, cohesive case biblically for women in ministry. And I went home and I thought, all right, I got my work cut out for me. And so I would say the last 10 years has been a continued journey of embracing that Scripture clearly makes room for men and women to serve alongside of one another. I'm going to read. I can talk fast. I was a broadcasting major. You should also know that. So I'm just going to dig in because we have 20 minutes and I want to leave space for Amanda and Yuhui to share their papers as well. Here we go. A Medieval Makeover, Women's Roles Before and After the Reformation. The journey of women's roles in the church is hardly a straight line. It's a rather curvy road with plenty of twists and turns, some pointing women to lead and at other times pointing them right out the door. The goal of this paper is to specifically examine the eras on either side of the Reformation. On one side, we will find women serving and leading in the church. And on the other, they will be serving and leading in their homes. What led to this drastic change? To answer this, we will need to take a few broad brushstrokes over the top of the history of the early church and its interpretations of Scripture and women before arriving on the doorstep of the Middle Ages. This is the era that will set the scene for where women land both before and after the Reformation. And what we will find is indeed a medieval makeover. This paper is aimed at exploring the various religious, social, and historic dynamics surrounding the Reformation that led to driving women out of leadership in the church and back into their homes, as well as the ways that we are experiencing the impact of some of these things today. Sissy Fairchild offers a robust study of women within religious and social circles in early modern Europe. In her opening chapter, Fairchild provides a compact summary that describes how patriarchal views were established and sustained in the early church, despite the Christian faith being one that is built largely on the premise of the spiritual equality of all human beings. She explains how patriarchal interpretations became the dominant and preferred narratives, beginning even with the story of creation. Genesis includes 2 accounts, the second of which, in Genesis 2, provides plenty of fodder for those in the church and the early Middle Ages who began to bear down on women more forcefully with regards to their accepted roles in the church and in society. In short, an interpretation of Genesis 2 that took root at that time painted Eve not as made in God's image, but in Adam's. Additionally, the fact that Eve was the one that was tricked by the serpent introduces the idea that perhaps women are intellectually inferior and thus more readily given over to deception. And thus, the story of women as the weaker gender was born. Despite a gospel that includes plentiful examples of Jesus elevating and liberating women, welcoming them into his ministry with verses like Galatians 3:28 from the Apostle Paul, which speak to the broad equality of all, male leaders in the church began to reinforce negative scripts about women with support from passages like Ephesians 5:22 and 23, 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35, and famously 1 Timothy 2:12 through 14. Fairchild proposes that perhaps these misogynistic interpretations were a response to the early life of the church when it was trying to move out from the underground and into the public sector where the Roman Empire surely had plenty to say about a male-dominated world. Perhaps the men in the church began to crawl back under the ground when they realized that the opposition their Christian faith would face if they allowed women to teach, preach, and lead. For indeed, these are the places that women had been during the nascent era of the first century church. What exactly then was the fear about continuing to allow women to rise up and share these spaces with men? Sadly, the script that began to circulate was this: women were nothing more than objects of sexual temptation. They would be dangerous to leaders in the church. They would lure others, especially men, into sin. One need only listen to the words of Tertullian, one of the earliest church fathers, to hear how readily these views were already being accepted. Quote, "And do you not know that you are Eve? God's sentence still hangs over all of your sex, and his punishment weighs down upon you. You are the devil's gateway." End quote. The early church fathers, including Augustine, John Chrysostom, and others, followed suit. Instead of being encouraged to marry, women were now encouraged to remain virgins and pursue a life of chastity. Fairchild says that in this way they could avoid the curse of Eve and gain salvation. She goes on to explain the impact of the mindset moving into the Middle Ages, saying, quote, "By the Middle Ages, Christianity had changed from a religion stressing the spiritual equality of all human beings to one whose message to women was of their essential sinfulness and their God-ordained subordination to men. This evolution took place because texts emphasizing female inferiority were frequently cited, while those emphasizing equality were ignored. This suggests that people found what they wanted to find in Christianity. They found the patriarchal paradigm there because they already believed in it," end quote. A new normal had begun to be accepted about women, and it would now hold for centuries. By the Middle Ages, we see women pushing up against these long-held beliefs. Some, like Christine de Pizan, from 1365 to 1429, herself a Christian, did so by thoughtfully reinterpreting passages like Genesis 2 in her written work, The City of Ladies. This written work sought to defend the long-held belief that women were so entrenched in sexual sin that perhaps they could not be saved. Pizan hoped to debunk ideas about gender roles and gender traits that could not be proven as natural inevitabilities. She went about her work not by directly refuting these ideas, but by carefully posing examples that might demonstrate counterthinking. In other words, she never came out and said men and women are equal. She merely sought to begin quietly undoing the assumed ideas that had been accepted by many in the church and within the society of her day. Pizan did not write alone. In the following century, her pen and resolve were joined by women like Marguerite de Navarre, a French royal, who wrote the novel Heptameron. This book is described as a set of linked stories about sacred and profane love told from a woman's point of view. De Navarre was followed by Spanish author Maria de Zaya, whose work Disenfranchisements of Love handled issues of violence against women, which ironically were more often told by male authors of romance novels. According to Fairchild, of the 10 stories written by Desire, 6 of them provided a woman's point of view depicting the murders of innocent women at the hands of their, quote, supposed patriarchal protectors, fathers, brothers, and husbands to guard masculine honor. In the other 4, they endured domestic violence before finding havens in the convents. This collection of writing alone is striking, as it seems to present the 2 main options that were being presented to women in the Middle Ages. Either to protect men by hiding the sexual temptation of women away in converts, or to repackage the temptation by giving them into the hands of protective patriarchal marriage. Either way, the goal at hand seemed to be protecting men from women. These are the dynamics that collided head-on with the Reformation. Considering that Luther nailed his infamous 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg in 1517, we now have plenty of pieces to move around the table around the roles of women to begin to understand where they landed both before and after the Reformation. In a world that now had rehearsed for centuries that women are sexually dangerous, deemed intellectually inferior, and incapable of leading, the Reformation became the perfect backdrop to using religion as an excuse to contain women even further. It's here that perhaps we should pause to hear from the revered leader of the Reformation, Martin Luther himself. What were his ideas about marriage, women, and their roles in the church? According to German theologian Gertrude Wittenberg-Tonsing, Luther had very strongly and defined views about all of these things. Tonsing reports that Luther, quote, rejected the emphasis on celibacy as a morally superior discipline. Rather, Luther and others now began to support the idea that marriage was the ultimate ideal for women and the higher calling, and now, instead of sexuality being a negative source of temptation, it could be celebrated as a gift from God. As Barbara McAfee highlights, this elevated the sacrament of marriage and shifted it to a solution to the perceived issues of women as sexual temptresses. Quote, since sexuality was no longer viewed as evil, the married woman at least was not cast in the role of temptress and seducer, end quote. Where sex and women had been before bad, now they were good. Now women could be seen as fulfilling God's call in their lives through marriage rather than working against God and men in ways that yielded corruption. Furthermore, marriage could become the thing that would continue to protect both men and women. Now women had a safe place to house their sexual desire, and rather than men being tempted, men could be served by women and their sexuality. This lit a fire under the flames of the Reformation and its doctrine. The ground underneath women's feet began to shift dramatically. The place of women in the church from the days of their first century position experienced a dramatic makeover. No longer were women leading and serving alongside of men in the church. Now they were being sent home to serve not alongside, but under men in nearly every sense of the word. Martin Luther affirmed the subordination of women as the result of woman's sin. John Calvin followed suit. He understood the Genesis 2 account as confirming the woman as helper to the man, since she was made after him, thus subordinate, and the fact that she was deceived in sin first merely added insult to injury in his mind. This led to removing the idea of vocation or calling as including those who entered formal religious orders in the priesthoods or convents. Now, it was the opposite. The idea of a set-apart life of virginity in a monastery was exchanged for women who were now reassigned to their new vocation as mothers and homemakers. The Reformation moved women into subordinate roles where their primary calling would now be to serve as submissive wives whose worth would be found in their ability to bear and rear children and to tend to the domestic home front. It was not just the birth of children that would mark this sudden shift. The cult of domesticity, though not officially recognized until the 19th century, was unofficially born, and we are still feeling its effects today. We will return to the cult of domesticity in a moment, but for now, let's zoom in on the immediate effects surrounding women during the time of the Reformation. In her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, Beth Allison Barr traces much of this history around views of women in the early church, the Middle Ages, and the Reformation all the way to present. Regarding the significant impact of the Reformation, Barr says this, quote, before the Reformation, women could gain spiritual authority by rejecting their sexuality. Virginity empowered them, end quote. She goes on to highlight how women became nuns, took religious vows. Women such as Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen contributed greatly to the leadership of the church. These medieval women served alongside men with authority. Quote, the further medieval women moved from marriage, the closer they were to God. But, Barr says, after the Reformation, the opposite became true for Protestant women. The more closely they identified with being wives and mothers, the more godly they became. Interestingly, in the case of Luther, Barr documents that Luther himself married an ex-runaway nun named Katharina von Bora, later known as Katie Luther. The fact that Luther himself married an ex-runaway nun seems to underscore his ideologies surrounding women during his era. Did he view himself as rescuing or redeeming a woman and her calling before God? McAfee seems to believe this to be the case. She sees marriage through the eyes of Luther and the Reformation as a, quote, redemptive rescue for women who were associated with sexual evil. Marriage via the Reformation liberated women from being seen as seducers. Barr goes on to highlight that Luther certainly preferred the Martha characters of the Gospels to the Mary, mother of Jesus types, because Martha could always be found faithfully serving in the kitchen and modeling domestic subservience. Mary, on the other hand, also underwent a makeover with the Reformation. Once esteemed for her virginity, Gertrude Tonsing points out that now, quote, Mary was rediscovered by Luther and others as a mother also of other children. According to Tonsing, the Reformation may have, quote, brought Mary back down to earth from her high and lofty status, but it did so by means of recasting the role of sexuality, procreation, and family life. It seems we traded one idealized role of Mary for another, and in so doing, continued to restrain women to roles that define them either merely by their sexuality or by their ability to procreate. It's here that we return to the cult of domesticity, as perhaps Mary was the first victim of this shift. From super spiritual virgin to domestic diva, Mary seems to have been the first to undergo this makeover. According to McAfee, while the cult of domesticity would not officially emerge for a few centuries, it most certainly began brewing as soon as Luther, Calvin, and the other reformers took on this new accepted norm for women as called to the home front to serve men and their families. McAfee described it this way, quote, by the middle of the 19th century in America, a cluster of ideas on the nature of women and their appropriate role was firmly planted in the popular mind of white America, end quote. She aptly identifies this cluster of ideas as the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity. McAfee describes this as the new American ideal, a woman who was submissive, morally pure, and pious. She found power and happiness in the role of wife and mother. Beth Allison Barr also speaks to this cult, saying that while it's hard to pinpoint its exact birth date, it was definitely conceived in the 19th century. Like McAfee, Barr identifies 4 characteristics of this cult of domesticity as piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. What is ironic here is that McAfee and Barr both point to the way women were now seen as the spiritual role models. This is why piety makes Barr's list for the cult of domesticity, where she explains the tenet that women are, quote, naturally more religious than men and more attuned to spiritual matters. McAfee echoes this purported idea of women being morally superior to men, thus adding spiritual instruction in the home to their list of domestic duties. Perhaps we would do well to remember what sparked the Reformation to begin with. Ultimately, it was Luther's desire to put an end to the corruption in the church via the sale of indulgences that kept others literally eating out of the hands of the priests who were deemed as the spiritual professionals. He sought to do away with these indulgences and to recover scripture into the hands of common people to feed themselves. At no point does it appear that Luther had a conscious goal to significantly alter the lives of women. Yet this became one of the unforeseen outcomes of his passionate reforms. Because one of the main thrusts of Luther's actions was to recover the authority of scripture, it put him in a difficult place. By the time the 16th century had arrived, the narratives about women as associated with sexual temptation and evil were centuries old. If Luther was going to recover the authority of Scripture, he had quite a hill to climb to undo the distorted interpretations about women that had already preceded him. As Fairchilds demonstrates, this would require Luther to recover the biblical idea of spiritual equality against ideas that women were spiritually inferior to men. While Luther partially succeeded, he came up against other German voices like that of Anabaptist preacher Balthasar Hümeyer. He is one example of the many European male voices who was writing in the church during the Reformation to strengthen views of women's subordination. Like others, he pointed to the old dichotomy between body and spirit to stress carnal and hence the evil nature of women. This left Luther at odds with a desire to recover scripture and its authority on one hand, while finding himself convinced that the life of celibacy was no longer a holy calling from God. Luther, in fact, attacked this way of life, invading convents and urging nuns to leave. Luther's influence was significant, and many joined him in these ideas and the efforts they produced. So where did this leave women at the time of the Reformation? Constrained, confused, conflicted, and as a result, a counter-reformation emerged. This was an effort on the part of women, primarily in the Catholic Church, who had felt called to serve God uniquely and desired to retain their sense of calling. Movements to decloister and reorganize took shape as women within fixed orders sought to move out into the community more visibly and shed their traditional garb. These women resisted the efforts of Luther and others to shut down their convents. But these Catholic women also feared that the Protestants would pounce on their desires to move into the public sector and would be looking for forms of immorality on the part of the clergy or the nuns, with which they could then charge the church with their new ideas of vocation. It seems Protestants were determined to catch those who wanted to be celibate in the act. It was as if they were waiting to simply say, see, we always knew women were seducers who were out to corrupt celibate men. McCaffey mentions one such Catholic sister named Jeannie de Jussy, who was determined to resist these dynamics and fought to maintain their religious orders. As a result, she and others experienced harassment from Protestant men because they voiced their disagreement with the way that Protestantism was now glorifying marriage. Jeannie de Jussy and sisters like her viewed this as, quote, the form of constraint on women. What were women in this era to do? They were being forced out of convents and into homes against their wills, while never really being truly liberated from the notion that they, as women, still existed to keep men happy and free from sexual temptation. It's not difficult to understand one of the striking trends that emerged during this time regarding women's wills. There are multiple documents that record that as women felt squeezed on both sides to please men, they found one way to liberate themselves: their wills in death. Stephanie Thompson and Katie Barclay have released very recent research documenting the way women in the 16th and 17th centuries saw their wills as a means to the agency they were denied while living. The construction of family memory is a central idea where women could exercise agency over not only how the family was envisioned for its own purposes, but how those representations could coalesce with other forms of historical knowledge making to shape stories of place and social positioning. Essentially, as research will bear, these women finally found a way to reject their constrained place in the church and as those who tended to much of the family affairs at home, and they used their wills to make a statement. I suppose we could say, where there's a will, there's a way. The religious patronage would not find its way back into the churches that had limited them. Instead, scores of women wrote their wills to direct their money to the poor. Women found a way to redirect the misuses of religious patronage that had prompted the Reformation to begin with, and now, rather than providing the money back to these religious institutions, bequests to parish churches decreased and poor relief came to dominate. Thompson and Barclay's work goes on to explore the way wills became a, quote, testament of post-mortem piety. The work of Simone Lacqua O'Donnell confirms this trend. She studied 600 wills composed between 1600 and 1650 in Munster, Germany, and discovered that overwhelmingly women bequeathed their money not to the church, but to the poor. While this is just one trend, it seems to suggest that women were determined to find a way to not have their identities bound and defined by the church, even if it meant using their will and death to make such a statement. As we step beyond the norms and assumed roles that took shape immediately following the Reformation, it is not hard to see how we are still, more than 4 centuries later, fighting the cult of domesticity. We have yet to fully recover a view of women that relegates them neither to sexually dangerous or fit only for domestic duties. In both cases, these views are external assessments that do not align with Scripture's manner of prescribing worth. On one hand, we have been taught to celebrate the way the Reformation put the Bible back into the hands of the people, but at the same time, it tied an apron around the waist of Christian women and bound them in their homes. The traces of the cult of domesticity remain as women struggle to be viewed as equals and not treated as sexual threats in the church. As Barr is quick to remind, quote, just because I agree with the Reformation theologically doesn't mean that everything that happened as a result of the Reformation is good, end quote. I agree. It would appear that while we Protestants were busy pulling the specks of control and monetary abuses out of the eyes of the Catholic Church, we thrust a plank of male dominance right through our own. The way women, their identity, sexuality, and viability for leadership in the church have been distorted seem intricately connected to the Reformation.
Barr highlights that, quote, "It is not an accident that the stories of the most authoritative women in Christian history stem from the 4th through the 10th centuries, when the authority structures of Christianity, not to mention the political structures to which Christianity became attached, were more fluid," end quote. I long for a return to the days of Teresa of Avila, Hilda von Bingen, and Catherine of Siena. I long for a day when women are freely leading, teaching, and preaching, not over men, not under men, but alongside of men. I dream of not needing to do the dance of equality to figure out how to just be without making men uncomfortable. Perhaps what I'm dreaming for is the very same thing that the prophet Joel dreamt when he prophesied. "I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. In those days, I will pour out my spirit even on servants, men and women alike." Yes, this day will come. May the church remember. May I remember. May we remember.